Kansas sunsets are a masterpiece, but to me, they're bittersweet. The golden glow over endless cornfields feels like a cruel joke. So much beauty, but no space for honesty. I've worked here for 10 years, sweating under the sun and playing the role of a straight-talking, beer-loving, all-American man. But my secret has a name: Jake. Jake and I have known each other for as long as I've worked here. He's the kind of guy everyone admires. Tall, broad-shouldered, and quick with a joke. To the world, he's the perfect embodiment of masculinity. To me, he's the only person who's ever seen past my mask. Our friendship was built on shared hardships, endless shifts, and cold beers after work. But it evolved into something neither of us planned. Each evening, as the others drifted back to the cabins, Jake and I would find our escape in the cornfield. It became our sanctuary, where no one could judge us. In the shadow of the stalks, we were just Jake and Ethan, two men holding on to the only genuine connection in our lives. There, his hand would brush mine, and the facade would crumble. One night, as the summer heat clung to the air, Jake leaned in closer than ever before. His voice was low, trembling with vulnerability. "Do you ever wish we didn't have to hide?" he asked. I swallowed hard, unable to admit that I thought about it every second of every day. Instead, I murmured, "More than anything." But the field wasn't impenetrable. It was only a matter of time before someone saw the truth we thought we'd hidden so well. In a place like this, secrets like ours aren't just dangerous, they're fatal. The day Danny stumbled upon us, the air felt heavier than usual. I should have noticed the warning signs, the silence in the field, the faint sound of footsteps that didn't belong to Jake or me. But in those stolen moments with him, the world always disappeared. Jake's lips were on mine, his hands resting on my hips when I heard it. The unmistakable crack of a branch underfoot. My body tensed, and Jake immediately stepped back. Our eyes darted through the stalks, and then we saw him, Danny, standing there with a twisted grin. Danny wasn't just any worker. He was the kind of man who thrived on cruelty, always looking for someone weaker to target. His presence alone sent a shiver down my spine. But the look on his face that day was different. It wasn't just smugness. It was malicious delight. "Didn't know the cornfield was good for more than just crops," he sneered, his voice laced with venom. Jake stepped in front of me, shielding me from Danny's gaze, but the damage was done. He'd seen everything. We tried to laugh it off when we returned to the cabins, pretending nothing had happened. But Danny's eyes followed us everywhere. The way he smirked when he saw us, the muttered comments under his breath. It all pointed to one thing. He wasn't going to let this go. That night, Jake and I lay awake in separate bunks, our minds racing. "He won't say anything," Jake whispered through the thin wall. But I wasn't so sure. In this world, men like Danny don't just let secrets stay buried. Danny's smirks turned into whispers, and whispers grew into rumors. He didn't confront us outright, but the air around us shifted. The other workers began to act differently, avoiding our glances, laughing a little too hard at Danny's crude jokes. It was clear he was planting seeds of suspicion. Jake tried to brush it off. "They don't know anything," he assured me. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he clenched his fists when Danny walked by. For someone who prided himself on being unshakable, Jake was starting to crack. One evening, as we finished our shift, Danny cornered me near the barn. "You think no one notices, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with contempt. You and Jake sneaking off every night. It's pathetic. I wanted to lash out, to punch him and end the smug look on his face, but I couldn't. Violence would only prove him right in the eyes of everyone else. Instead, I spoke quietly. "Stay out of my business, Danny." He just laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "This isn't just your business, Ethan. People like you don't belong here, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." I didn't tell Jake about the encounter. He had enough on his plate and I didn't want to add to his worries. But a knot of fear settled in my chest, tightening with every passing day. Danny wasn't just talking, he was planning. I noticed him spending more time near the machinery, tinkering with the combine harvester. At first, I thought he was just doing maintenance. But then I overheard him talking to another worker, his voice low and conspiratorial. "That machine can tear through anything," he said with a chilling smile. "Anything." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Danny wasn't just trying to expose us, he was planning something far worse. I wanted to warn Jake, but how could I explain my suspicions without sounding paranoid? And even if I was right, what could we do? Jake and I continued meeting in the cornfield, clinging to the only solace we had. But the space that once felt like a haven now felt like a trap. Every rustle of the stalks, every distant sound of machinery sent my heart racing. One night, as we lay side by side in the dirt, Jake turned to me with a soft smile. "I don't care what Danny or anyone else thinks," he said. "As long as I have you, I can handle anything." His words should have comforted me, but they didn't. The fear in my chest was growing too large to ignore. Danny's plan was in motion, and we were running out of time. The air carried a weight that night, a suffocating pressure that pressed against my chest as I walked to the cornfield. Jake and I had agreed to meet after our shift, as always, but the feeling that something wasn't right lingered in my mind. Danny had been unusually quiet during the day, which was more unsettling than his usual taunts. Quiet meant he was up to something. When I reached the edge of the field, Jake was already there, leaning against one of the stalks. His face lit up when he saw me, his smile pulling me out of my dark thoughts for a moment. "Thought you weren't coming," he teased, pulling me into a quick embrace. His touch was warm, grounding, and I let myself relax for the first time all day. But the peace was fleeting. As Jake and I sank deeper into the field, the night grew eerily silent. The usual sounds of crickets and distant machinery were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. I whispered, "Something feels off tonight." Jake shrugged it off, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "You worry too much, Ethan. It's just us here." That was the lie we told ourselves to keep going. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true anymore. I glanced back toward the edge of the field, half expecting to see Danny's shadow lurking. The thought of him watching, waiting, made my stomach churn. Jake noticed my unease and kissed me softly. "No one's gonna take this from us," he murmured. I wanted to believe him. Just as we were about to lose ourselves in the moment, the faint hum of the combine harvester reached my ears. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was too far away, too subtle to be real. But then it grew louder, a steady roar cutting through the silence. I froze, my breath hitching. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jake frowned, his head tilting to listen. The color drained from his face as the noise became unmistakable. "Ethan, run," he said, his voice firm and urgent. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the ground in fear. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the edge of the field. The harvester roared louder, its metallic growl shaking the ground beneath our feet. My chest tightened as I realized the stalks that once hid us now seemed like prison bars. Danny was driving the machine straight toward us, and every fiber of my being screamed to move. Jake grabbed my arm and pulled me forward, his voice sharp and urgent. "Run, Ethan! Don't stop!" We bolted through the cornfield, the stalks whipping against our faces and arms. The sound of the harvester grew closer with every second, its destructive blades tearing through the rows behind us. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned as I struggled to keep up with Jake. He was always faster, stronger, but I refused to let him leave me behind. The field was a maze, the tall stalks disorienting under the dim light of the setting sun. We zigzagged, hoping to lose Danny, but the sound of the harvester was relentless. It was as if he could sense our every move, adjusting his path to corner us. Jake turned to me, his eyes wide with determination. "Stay close to me. Don't look back." But I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the harvester's monstrous silhouette looming closer. The machine was merciless, cutting through everything in its path. Danny's figure was barely visible behind the controls, but his intent was clear. This wasn't just a chase, it was a hunt. He wasn't going to stop until one or both of us were gone. Jake led us toward what seemed like a clearing, but as we broke through the stalks, we realized it was a dead end. The rows of corn curved inward, trapping us in a small circle of open dirt. My heart sank as the harvester's roar grew deafening, its headlights piercing through the corn. Jake turned to me, his expression shifting from panic to resolve. "Ethan, listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "When I tell you to run, you run. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just go." I shook my head, my throat tightening with fear. "I'm not leaving you," I whispered, my voice cracking. But Jake wasn't having it. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip firm. "You have to. One of us has to make it out of here." The harvester burst through the last row of corn, its blades gleaming in the dim light. Jake shoved me hard, sending me stumbling toward the edge of the clearing. "Run, Ethan!" he shouted, his voice raw and desperate. I hesitated for a split second, torn between my fear and my love for him. Then I turned and ran, my legs moving on autopilot as tears streamed down my face. Behind me, I heard the harvester's engine reach a deafening pitch, followed by the sickening crunch of metal against flesh. The sound was so final, so horrifying, that it stopped me in my tracks. I turned back, my heart pounding, but all I could see was the harvester, its massive frame blocking everything else. Jake was gone. The walk back to the cabins felt like a dream, or rather, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My body moved on autopilot, each step heavier than the last. The reality of what had happened was too much to process. Jake, the man who had been my everything, was gone, and I hadn't been able to save him. When I reached the edge of the field, the distant chatter of the other workers brought me back to the present. They were sitting around the fire pit, laughing and drinking as if nothing had happened. My fists clenched at my sides as anger surged through me. How could the world keep turning after what I had just lost? Danny was nowhere in sight, but his absence was as loud as his presence. I knew he was hiding, waiting for the storm to pass. He thought he had won, that he had silenced us forever. But the fire inside me was growing, fueled by the image of Jake's face in his last moments. Danny hadn't won. Not yet. I stumbled into the cabin Jake and I had shared, the familiar scent of him hitting me like a freight train. His bunk was neatly made, just as he had left it that morning. I sank onto the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands as the grief overtook me. The weight of it was suffocating, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. For hours I sat there, reliving every moment we had spent together. The way he smiled when he saw me, the sound of his laugh, the way his hand felt in mine. Those memories were all I had left now, and I clung to them like a lifeline. But beneath the sorrow, a new emotion began to take root. Rage. By the time the sun rose, I knew what I had to do. Jake's death couldn't go unanswered. Danny thought he had destroyed us, but he had only destroyed himself. I would make sure of it. I would carry Jake's memory with me, and I would fight for the love we had shared. It was the only way to honor him. Rumors spread like wildfire through the farm, each one more twisted than the last. Some said Jake had been careless, that he had wandered too close to the harvester by accident. Others whispered that he had been drunk, stumbling into the machine's path. No one dared to suggest the truth, that Danny had orchestrated the entire thing. I kept my head down, pretending to be just as clueless as the rest of them. But inside, I was boiling with anger. Every time I saw Danny laughing with the other workers or sharpening his tools, I had to fight the urge to confront him. He walked around like nothing had happened, as if he hadn't stolen the only person who had ever truly loved me. I started watching him, studying his routines and habits. He was careful, always looking over his shoulder, but he wasn't perfect. I noticed how he lingered near the machinery late at night, how he avoided certain conversations. He was trying to cover his tracks, but his guilt was written all over him. The other workers didn't suspect a thing. They accepted Danny's version of events without question, too caught up in their own lives to dig deeper. It was infuriating, but it also gave me an advantage. No one was paying attention to me, which meant I could move unnoticed. Late one night, I returned to the cornfield, flashlight in hand. The harvester sat where it had been abandoned, its blades still stained with Jake's blood. My stomach churned at the sight, but I forced myself to look closer. There, on the ground near the machine, was a piece of Jake's bracelet, something he never took off. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was a small piece of him, something tangible to hold on to. I pocketed the bracelet and stood there for a long time, staring at the harvester. This was where Jake's life had ended, but it wouldn't be where his story ended. Danny had made a mistake, and I was going to make sure he paid for it. The nights felt longer after Jake was gone, as if time itself stretched to remind me of his absence. The farm's silence, once a comfort, now felt like a mockery. Each evening, I stood on the edge of the cornfield staring at the rows of stalks that had both hidden and destroyed the love of my life. This was where Jake had saved me, where he had given his life to protect me. It was where Danny had taken everything, and it was where I would make sure Jake's sacrifice wasn't in vain. The other workers carried on as if nothing had changed, their laughter and conversations grating against my frayed nerves. Danny, the coward that he was, didn't even bother to feign remorse. He strutted around the farm with an air of invincibility, as if he were untouchable. His smirks, his careless jokes, his loud boasts, they all ignited a fire in me that burned hotter with each passing day. I spent my nights alone, lying awake on Jake's bunk. His scent still clung to the sheets, a bittersweet reminder of the man I loved. I clutched the piece of his bracelet I had found near the harvester, running my thumb over its worn edges. It was my anchor, a physical piece of him that kept me from losing myself entirely to the darkness. But it wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough until Danny paid for what he had done. My plan began to take shape in the quiet hours of the night. Danny thought he had won, thought he had erased Jake and me from existence, but he didn't realize that his actions had sown the seeds of his own downfall. I started watching him closely, observing his routines, his habits. He was a creature of habit, predictable in ways that made my task easier. He spent his nights near the machinery, tinkering with tools or sharpening the harvester's blades. It was almost poetic. He didn't realize he was sealing his own fate. One evening, I approached the harvester under the cover of darkness. The massive machine loomed like a beast, its blades still stained from the night it had taken Jake. My heart pounded as I ran my fingers along its metal frame, the memories of that night flashing through my mind. I could still hear the roar of the engine, the crunch of the blades, Jake's voice shouting for me to run. My hands trembled, but I steadied myself. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Danny's arrogance was his weakness. He never bothered to lock the tool shed or secure the machinery. He believed he was untouchable, that no one would dare challenge him. I used that arrogance against him, making small adjustments to the harvester while he wasn't looking. It was subtle at first, loosened bolts, tampered wires, but enough to plant the seeds of doubt in his mind. He started glancing over his shoulder more often, his confidence wavering. It was the first crack in his armor, and I intended to exploit it. As the days passed, I worked in silence, avoiding unnecessary interactions with the other workers. They didn't suspect a thing. To them, I was just another farmhand, grieving quietly for a friend lost to a tragic accident. But inside, I was a storm, my resolve growing stronger with each passing moment. Jake's voice echoed in my mind, his words from our last night together haunting me. "Don't let them take this from us," he had said. I wouldn't. The final piece of my plan fell into place on a moonless night. Danny was alone in the tool shed, sharpening the harvester's blades as he always did. I watched from the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I stepped forward, the piece of Jake's bracelet clenched tightly in my hand. "Danny," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He turned, startled at first, but then his lips curled into a sneer. "What do you want, Ethan?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. I took another step forward, the distance between us closing. "You think you got away with it," I said, my voice low. "You think you erased Jake, erased us, but you didn't." Danny laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Jake was weak," he spat, "just like you. You don't belong here." His words stung, but they only fueled my determination. I stepped closer, my grip on the bracelet tightening. "You're wrong," I said. "Jake was stronger than you'll ever be, and he's not the one who's going to pay." Before he could react, I lunged, slamming him against the wall of the shed. The tools clattered to the ground as he struggled against me, but I held firm. The weight of my grief, my anger, my love for Jake, all of it gave me strength. "You took everything from me," I hissed, my voice trembling with emotion. "Now, it's your turn to lose." Danny's eyes widened in fear as he realized I wasn't bluffing. For the first time, the smug mask he always wore slipped, revealing the coward beneath. I didn't kill him, not then, not there, but I left him with a promise. "You're going to pay for what you did," I said, my voice steady. "And when you do, Jake will finally have justice." As I walked away, the wind rustled through the cornfield, carrying Jake's memory with it. The fight wasn't over, but I had taken the first step. Danny would pay for his crimes, and Jake's love would never be forgotten. I looked down at the bracelet in my hand, a sense of calm washing over me. This was only the beginning. Jake's story wasn't over, and neither was mine. This story invites us to reflect on the weight of secrets, the cruelty of prejudice, and the strength of love, even in the harshest circumstances. Ethan and Jake lived in a world where they were forced to hide who they truly were, trapped in a society that punished differences with violence and hatred. Yet, amidst all the pain, their courage to love and Ethan's determination to honor Jake's memory show that justice and truth cannot be silenced even in the darkest moments. Jake's loss is a devastating blow, but Ethan's vow for vengeance carries something deeper. The resolve that Jake's memory will not be erased, and the love they shared was real and worth fighting for. This narrative challenges us to think about how far we are willing to go to protect those we love and to stand up for what we believe is right. In the end, this isn't just a story of love and tragedy. It's a story of resilience, of fighting against injustice, and of how even the deepest pain can transform into strength to move forward. Now it's your turn. What's your opinion about this story? Did you enjoy it? Or do you think it could have been different? Your feedback is incredibly important to us. Drop your comment below with the rating you'd give this story. And don't forget to follow the channel to get amazing stories like this every day. Don't miss out. Rate the story, follow the channel, and hit the notification bell.